Hi, everybody. We're back with part 2 of the Tall Buildings lecture. I wanted to take a little bit of a tangent away from talking about the buildings themselves to talking about an interesting byproduct of their height. So parades had been a tradition in New York City going all the way back to the Dutch era. This is a annual firemen's torchlight procession going up Broadway in 1858. This is Lincoln's funeral procession in 1865, going up around Union Square and then back down to City Hall. So there were funerals and there were celebratory parades. This is a parade in 1884 when Thomas Edison, who was just then developing the incandescent light bulb, got his employees to march in a parade, and he put light bulbs on each of their helmets. You can see there, and in the middle, it's kind of hard to see, but they're dragging a generator. So that's where they're getting their power. This is a Columbus Day parade, 1892, working its way around Union Square. But when buildings got really tall, especially down in lower Manhattan, an interesting thing happened. And it was the convergence of the height of these new skyscrapers and an invention in the financial industry, which was the stock ticker, which was an intricate brass machine about the size of a modern day coffee maker. And these machines were in every office on Broadway and Wall Street, and they ticked out stock quotes all day on a continuous strip of paper. And that was the ticker tape. And they would read off the stock quotes constantly, and then they would tear it off. And so it generated a lot of waste. And these long ribbons of paper were gathering in the corners of every office. And the very first ticker tape parade was in 1886, when a group after peeled off from the parade that had gone down to the Battery for the dedication of the Statue of Liberty. And this was a group that peeled off from the main parade, I guess because they weren't invited to go over to Liberty Island for the dedication of the statue. So they had nothing to do. And so they started marching down Wall Street from Broadway. And this was a group of Army veterans, firemen, and a group of students from Columbia and City College. It's 1886. And they were in high spirits and they were making noise. And so office workers above them heard this commotion. And as a practical joke, they began dumping all the used ticker tape out of the window onto the parade below, onto these people who were making noise. So it's interesting that the ticker tape parade, which is this tradition that is so associated with New York City, began as a practical joke. And for years after that, it was considered a practical joke. And only gradually, over the next 20 years or so, did it become something that was accepted as a appropriate response to a celebration. But the skyscraper, it wouldn't have worked, the ticker tape parade, without skyscrapers, because the whole point is that you throw them from really high up, obviously, to the street below. Excuse me. So at first, ticker tape parades, which were much, much more common in the early 20th century, early to mid 20th century than they are now. They had them on an average of about every 6 weeks in the 20s and 30s. And now they're much less common, unfortunately. Here you can see them. Here's a parade going up Broadway, north of Broadway, and here's a better view. This is Amelia Earhart. She got 2 parades. She's one of the few people that got 2 ticker tape parades in her honor twice. But some of the other people who were honored were Theodore Roosevelt, Charles Lindbergh after he flew across the Atlantic Ocean in 1927, Jesse Owens, the great track star, Albert Einstein, Winston Churchill, John F. Kennedy, who we'll see in a minute. There's Kennedy. But the ticker tape, at this point, you can see this is 1960. There's Kennedy and Jackie O. This was when he was running for president. And you can see in the background there that the ticker tape was still these really long lines of tape. This is still the original ticker tape. But gradually, ticker tape fell out of favor, so they started using other things as technology changed. So here you can see these things on the windowsill here above Broadway are computer punch cards. So for a while they were using stuff like that. And then today, if you go to a ticker tape parade, they just throw out 8.5 by 11 paper or shredded 8.5 by 11 paper. If you ever get a chance to go to a ticker tape parade, you must. It's an incredible experience, I found. I went to one in 2008, and it's an amazing experience. So if and when we do another one, you got to go. And maybe, you know, right now we all have to be 6 feet apart and quarantined and everything. A ticker tape parade is definitely not something to do during a pandemic. When I was there, I was so crowded in. I was wedged up against so many other people at the corner of Broadway and Wall Street that I couldn't raise my arms. That kind of crush. So it's not something that we want to do in a pandemic for sure. But it would be nice, wouldn't it, that once this whole nightmare is over, we could have a ticker tape parade in honor of doctors and nurses and everybody. That would be really cool. And I predict that will happen eventually, not anytime soon, but maybe a year from now, there'll be a ticker tape parade for the doctors and nurses, I guarantee it. And that'll be something to see, and we can all go out and celebrate. Let's see, so back to the buildings, and now I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Now we're into the 20th century, and I'm just going to talk about some of the iconic skyscrapers that were built then. And look at that skyline. I mean, the skyscraper just completely transformed New York City. And would you believe, looking at that image, that that's the same part of town that was shown in that Costello plan that we've looked at a million times from 1660? That's the same place. What would the Dutch think? You know, what would Peter Stuyvesant think if you brought him back and showed him this and told him, you know, all the streets are still there that you laid out, you know, Broadway is still there and Wall Street and all the other ones. We've extended the island a little bit, we've widened it, and he would say, my God, how did you build those towers into the sky? Well, we did because land is scarce, and we did it because we could. And they're pretty cool. I mean, what an amazing skyline. So let's hit a couple of the Art Deco skyscrapers from the Depression. This is 1930. Chrysler Building, which frequently comes in #1 on various reader polls of their favorite building in New York. Definitely in my top 10, although it's not my favorite. I'm going to show you my favorite pretty soon. But the architect here was William Van Allen. His nickname was the Doctor of Altitude. And briefly, the Chrysler Building, I think for about a year, was the world's tallest building. And you all know this one, right? It's on 42nd Street, just east of Grand Central Terminal. These are just snapshots that I took but it's such an extraordinary building. It's got that rocket ship top on it, Art Deco detail. It looks like a hood ornament for a Chrysler, and all its details are kind of inspired by automobiles. It's got these insane details, sheet metal details coming off of it at various points. Most memorably, these kind of, I guess they're eagle gargoyles that look like hood ornaments on a car coming out of the facade. Just spectacular. I mean, so cool looking and so kind of funny and whimsical too. And then this is the lobby, which is worth seeing. If you're ever down there, you gotta walk into the lobby. The overall form of the building is really cool, but the lobby is great too. I mean, look at that doorway. Look at that. And this is inside the lobby. Oops, I thought I had more images of that. They might be out of order. Well, we may see them or we may not in a second. So the Chrysler Building was the world's tallest just briefly, and then the Empire State Building quickly surpassed it when it opened in 1931 in the midst of the Great Depression. And the Empire State is by the firm of Shreve, Lamb, and Harmon, prolific firm. 67 elevators. That's a lot of elevators. And I mean, this building has become the symbol of New York, really. I mean, it's more recognizable than just about anything else on the skyline. And it's probably the building most associated with New York. It was built in record time. It was something like 18 months from start to finish. And it's got that great top. I mean, I don't like this building as well as the Chrysler Building, but it's still pretty great. When I first moved to New York, I worked for an architect on 28th Street, just 6 blocks away. And I worked on the 17th floor, and during my lunch hour, I would crawl out on the parapet, this tiny little parapet, and eat my lunch out there. And it had this great view facing north, facing the Empire State Building. So I got to watch the Empire State Building every day while I had my lunch. And it just, having just moved to New York, it just made me feel like I had really hit the big time. Here it is, of course, at night. The whole top lights up with various colors, which can get really dramatic when the clouds are low. And of course, you know what happened at the top of the Empire State Building in 1933, King Kong being attacked by airplanes and swatting them away like mosquitoes. This is still my favorite version of this movie. There have been, I think, 3 versions now. Anyway, I love the most recent, which I think came out in like 2006. It's really good too. I enjoyed seeing that, but the 1933 version is really great. And here are the missing Chrysler Building lobby slides I wanted to show you. Out of order. Here's a mural that includes a picture of the Chrysler Building itself. And that great Art Deco detail continues all the way down to the littlest detail. Here's a mailbox in the lobby made out of brass. I mean, look at the detail on that. So these buildings, these great skyscrapers, you might ask yourself, not only who designed them, but who built them? Who were these people who put up these steel cages way up in the stratosphere? Well, this is an iconic image of workers. I think this is the Empire State Building. I'm pretty sure it is. Having their lunch out on a steel beam. See guys on the far left there lighting cigarettes and happy as clams. They're, these workers were black and white. They were native born and immigrant. A lot of them were Italian immigrants. There were a lot of steel workers and stonemasons working on these buildings who were from Italy, because at this point, there was still mass immigration coming over from Italy. But a lot of them were born here. And a lot of them were, look at this guy, calmly drinking his milk, 1,200 feet above the city. These guys also drink, the guy on the left is drinking some milk. There's also a fair amount of beer drinking on these sites. So a lot of the workers on these tall buildings were Mohawk Indians who would come down seasonally from upstate and would work part of the year here. They lived in a neighborhood in Brooklyn, Boerum Hill, which is right close to where I live. That was kind of the main Mohawk neighborhood in the 5 boroughs. And a lot has been written about this, the myth of the Mohawk Indians working in these tall steel buildings, working as riveters and things like that. And a lot has been made about their so-called natural proclivity to not mind working up high, that somehow Mohawk Indians naturally don't have fear of height. I don't think that's correct. I think they did it because they needed the work and they were good at it. And their cousins and uncles and brothers were doing it, so they would tend to recommend somebody that they knew, and so more and more of them were working. I think it's one of those things like rock climbing where if you do it, you just get used to it. And you're 2,000 feet up in the air, but it's your job and it's your craft. And I don't buy the idea that the Mohawk Indians just naturally weren't afraid of heights. I think they were certainly brave, but they were good at what they did. And I think that explains it. But it's interesting that a lot of these buildings were built by Mohawk steel workers. And there's a great essay by Joseph Mitchell called The Mohawks in High Steel. And I actually used to assign that reading in this class. So if anybody's interested in reading that, I'm sure that I can put it up on Dropbox. My copy of that book is at school, which is inaccessible, but I think I have a scan of that essay. If anybody wants to read it, just email me. It's worth reading. It's really interesting. And then I'm kind of going to randomly pick a few iconic skyscrapers from the modern era. There are so many, I could do 10 lectures on these, but I'm just going to pick some of my favorites and some of the most famous of the post-World War II modern era. And one of the most important is the Seagram building. This is on Park Avenue, and this was finished in 1958. And its architects were the great German modernist Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, who apparently worked on the exterior of the building, and the American architect Philip Johnson, who did the interiors. There's Johnson on the left and Mies van der Rohe on the right with a model of the Seagram. So the Seagram building was one of the first modern buildings that was trying to express the idea of form following function, that everything here was functional and that there was no ornament applied to it, which it turns out that that's not true, because you can see there are these vertical columns in the facade, and only some of those are structural. A lot of the ones in between are purely decorative. So it's a bit of a lie, but the idea certainly took hold, and this building was replicated and inspired probably thousands of similar kind of reductive, abstracted, rectangular box-like skyscrapers. This is still the best, in my opinion, in terms of its craft. It's meticulously built, beautifully proportioned, and its material sense is almost, I would say, flawless. It's this steel columns, or maybe they're copper-clad columns on the outside, and all the glass. The other thing that's, you could see it maybe here a little better, is that this was one of the first buildings that, for better or worse, ignored the street grid, and it pulled back from the street, opening up this plaza, which in the case of the Seagram building is a really delightful space. But unfortunately, this idea was overused and abused and created a lot of really forlorn spaces in cities where the whole street edge lost its integrity entirely, and a lot of these plazas were underused and became desolate spaces full of trash, and where nobody wanted to go. But this is in the heart of Manhattan on Park Avenue, so this plaza is really well used. The Four Seasons restaurant, the famous Four Seasons, is inside this building, which is a landmark that was designed by Johnson. And I have never been there, but someday maybe I'll go there. There's another restaurant designed by Diller Scofidio. I'm not sure if it's still there, but I did go to that one, and that was pretty cool. Sorry. So then there's the World Trade Center, folks. And it just occurred to me, but you guys are probably, oh my God, you're probably too young to remember this building. It was built between 1966, when I was born, and 1973, when I was 7 years old. And the architect is the great Minoru Yamasaki, great architect, Japanese. So there were the two towers, of course, everybody remembers those, but the Trade Center was actually 6 buildings. So 4 of the buildings were shorter. And each of the 2 towers was 110 stories. And for a while, the World Trade Center was the tallest building or buildings in the world. Here they are under construction in Battery Park City. And this part of Manhattan is all fill. So this is part of the island that they gradually filled in over the centuries. And so the Trade Center, in order to build it, I wish I had thought to include a drawing of this, but they had to be built inside foundations that were called the bathtubs. They were concrete foundations, and that allowed enough stability to build on what was essentially fill. Here they are. This is in the 80s, after the World Financial Center was built, kind of around them. Those shorter buildings there are built by Caesar Pelli. But you can see the 2 towers there. This is from the Hudson River side. One of the towers, I forget which one was number 1 and which one was number 2, but one of the towers had this gigantic radio TV antenna on top of it, which was in itself the size of a skyscraper. These things were just completely out of scale to the rest of the city. They were just of a completely different order. But you know, the thing I loved about the World Trade Center is that, again, like the Seagram building, these were not dumb boxes. You know, these were meticulously detailed, and I loved the way that the I don't even know what you call these spandrels would come up from the ground and then branch out into 3 and then go up the whole facade. So the lower levels of the Trade Center were just beautiful, really, really well crafted. The edges of each building were mitered. It wasn't a 90 degree angle, it was a 45 degree angle. But you didn't really see that until you got up close to them. The lobby was really something to see, just really beautiful. Very warm, a lot of wood and stuff like that. And the disadvantage of this facade with all of these vertical members is that when you were in the Trade Center, it was very difficult to see out. All the windows were very narrow, and that was kind of annoying. And then at the top of it, there was a restaurant called Windows on the World, which I went to 4 or 5 times, which was so high up that you would go to the windows of this restaurant and look out, and it's not like you would look into Manhattan. You would look into New Jersey because you were so high up. It was like being on the moon or something. It's just incredible. And I just love these buildings. I love these buildings. And I really resented it when architecture critics after September 11th kind of implied that the city was better off without them. I thought that was really offensive. This is the East River view. So looking from Brooklyn, lower Manhattan, and you can see how the Trade Center just kind of lorded it over all the other buildings. I love the fact that there were 2 of them. I think if there had only been 1 of them, they wouldn't have been as powerful. But somehow the fact that there were 2 of them, it's almost like they're starting to form a team. You know, like if there are 2 of them, there could easily be 3. And if there are 3, maybe there'll be a dozen. And they just seemed to me like this kind of like Martians coming down and marching across Manhattan. They were just so tough and badass. And a whole city built with these buildings would be a nightmare, but I love them, and I love looking at them and visiting them. I went there a lot of times, inside and out. And you may have seen this person. This is the French acrobat Philippe Petit. And shortly after I think the buildings had opened, but they had just opened. This was 1974. And he strung a wire between the 2 towers and walked across back and forth, not just once or twice, but back and forth. He lay down on the wire. He jumped up and down on the wire with police on either side trying to capture him. And this is depicted in a documentary from 2008 called Man on Wire, which if you haven't seen it, you must. It's a really great movie. I love it. A lot of people thought this was really stupid. I thought it was great. I really thought it was great and brave, and I'm glad it wasn't me. But I have to admire him, for doing this.